to promote as much trust as possible in the group. And so this is, one thing that we talk about in the book is that, in the economy and when we're dealing with issues about, how to create money or how to create goods, things that other people will enjoy, these networks that we create are critical. But these are ones that we create thinking about what structure we are going to use to get a certain kind of outcome. And in real life, when you make friends with somebody, you're not necessarily trying to get an outcome for the whole group. You're making a single decision. You're deciding whether or not to be friends with one other person, or you're deciding whether or not to date one other person or to marry one other person. And each of us is doing this independently. And what ends up happening is you get these structures that are complex. They're not simple like the ones we've just talked about. And it really raises the question, are there patterns here that we can understand that will help us to figure out why it is that we form networks the way that we do? And so in one chapter of the book, we talk about a fundamental thing that is on everyone's mind, which is finding Mr. or Mrs. Right. Now, if it's the case that you think that there are only 1 in a million people out there for you, now, on the one hand, that's bad odds. You're going to have to go on about 1 million dates to find that person if you're dating people at random. On the other hand, it seems like it might be kind of good odds because there are 6,000 people out there in the world for you somewhere, if you could only find them. Well, the surprising power of social networks is that we actually spend a lot of time searching our friends and our friends' friends and our friends' friends' friends for Mr. and Mrs. Right. And they turn out to be a fantastic resource. In fact, as we say in the book, studies have shown that about 2 in 3 of spouses, of partners, met one another via a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend of a friend. In other words, these 2 people were no more than 3 degrees of separation removed before they started dating and before they got married. And so these 6,000 people that are out there just waiting for you, one of them is bound to be in your network, and your friends are going to help you find this person. And so this is one way that networks form. But in order to think about, really the function of networks, we need to think about what flows across them. And so another thing that we try to think about in the book is we think about how these networks influence health. And so this is the area that Nicholas Christakis and I have spent the most of our research thinking about, which is how is it that one person's health status influences another person's health status? And so we've created these maps, and you'll notice that these maps are very complex, where what we do is we color each circle to tell us something about the person and color each line to tell us something about the relationship. And so, for example, in our maps of obesity, we color the normal weight people green, we color the obese people yellow, and we actually make the size of the node proportional to body mass index. So bigger nodes are literally bigger. We color the relationships purple for friend and spouse ties. We call them orange for family ties. And that way we can see who's connected to whom and how is this obesity epidemic being transmitted from one person to another. And the very first thing that you notice when you look at one of these beautiful images is that there's clustering. And in fact, statistically speaking, what we can say is that if I don't know anything about you other than whether or not your friend's friend's friend is obese, then I have a better than average chance of saying whether or not you're obese. Okay, so we live in these clusters with other people who are very much like us in terms of obesity, in terms of our smoking behavior, in terms of our drinking behavior, in terms of our drug use behavior, in terms of our sleep behavior. We discuss a lot of these health effects in the book. Now, just because there's clustering, just because we see that 2 people are connected to one another and they are the same, doesn't mean that one person influences the other person. And so one possibility is that we just happen to find one of these clusters in the network, right? So it'd be like flipping a coin 10 times. Sometimes you're going to get 10 heads, right? So that's actually a pretty easy problem to deal with. We can actually shuffle the network around and see if we get the same patterns, and as it turns out, we don't. And so we're pretty sure it's not just something that's random. Another thing that you can do is you can analyze the extent to which people form friendships with one another. And there's this very important property in networks called homophily. It's a word that literally means love of like. And it's this idea that we tend to make friends with people who are like us. We tend to be attracted to people who have the same qualities as us. And so when you see this network of obesity, what you might be finding actually is that people who are of normal weight are attracted to be friends with people of normal weight. or people with obesity are attracted to be friends with people who are experiencing obesity. And so that's another thing that you have to sort of think about whenever you're looking at these network maps. Another possibility is that you have things that affect both people who are connected independently. And so maybe a McDonald's has just opened up down the street and the two of you can't help yourselves. That doesn't mean that you chose the other person because of their weight. It doesn't mean that you're influencing the other person to be a certain weight. It just means there's something else that's affecting both of you at the same time. And so this is called a contextual effect. So this is another thing that we need to think about in these networks to see whether or not it's causing this clustering, or if in fact what's causing the clustering is what we think is causing it, which is that one person is influencing another, and because the connections don't end there, this is like tipping over one domino, which then tips over another domino, and we want to see how far this cascade actually spreads in the network. And so the way that we were able to do this was we stumbled on a data resource in the Framingham Heart Study. By accident, just to keep people in the study, they were recording social network information for the last 32 years. And so this is 5,000 people over 32 years that we have information not only about their health status, but also about how their networks changed over time. And we can even make movies of these that really give us an idea of how it is that human beings are forming these beautiful networks and how we are interacting with one another in a way that has nothing to do with being an individual, but has a lot more to do with being a superorganism, like what E.O. Wilson talks about when he talks about groups of ants or other social insects. And so when we play these movies, what you can see is that there are people who are becoming friends and who are ending friendships. People are getting married and getting divorced. And one thing that we notice in particular over these 32 years is that all the nodes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Just like in the rest of the United States, the people in Framingham were experiencing the obesity epidemic. And by using this information, we're able to control for homophily, control for this tendency to choose people of the same type, and after that, see whether or not when one person becomes obese, does it then follow that their friend becomes obese? Another thing that we're able to do is we're able to utilize a really important thing in this network that's a little bit sad for the people involved, but it makes researchers happy. Sometimes one person will name another person as a friend, but that person doesn't name them back. Are you supposed to say, "Aw, no, aw, poor"? Now, this is unfortunate for the person who wasn't named. But for the researcher, this is actually a way to see whether or not contextual effects are driving the relationships. Because if McDonald's opens up down the street and it's making both of us obese, it's not going to care whether or not I name you as a friend or whether or not you name me as a friend. And so if I find that I have a stronger effect on you than you have on me when you've named me as a friend, then that suggests that there's influence going on. And this is exactly what we find. We find that the person that you name as a friend, if they become obese, it increases your risk of obesity by 70%. If the two of you name one another as a friend, you're a mutual friendship, a stronger kind of friendship, it actually triples your risk of obesity if they become obese. And it doesn't go in the other direction. It's not significantly different from zero, the effect of a naming friend on a person who is named as a friend, which suggests that the influence is flowing from the person who is named to the namer. And so it's very hard without experiments, without a clinical trial, to say something about causality. But social networks are special in that they're able to help us learn something more about whether or not influence is going on. Now, we've also looked at not just health behaviors, but also at emotions. And so in one study, for example, we looked at happiness, and whether or not happiness spreads from person to person. In these network maps, what we're able to do is we're able to see that we find very much the same properties that we found for health behavior. So we have clusters of happy people in the network, like the yellow nodes in the map that I'm showing here. We also have clusters of unhappy people who, of course, are colored blue. Yeah, get a laugh. And green is sort of in between on these maps. But the idea here is that we're finding, again, that for emotions like happiness, like loneliness, and also for psychological outcomes like depression, we get these clusters of 3 degrees of separation. If your friend's friend's friend is depressed, it increases the likelihood that you're depressed. And so overall, what we're finding And what we talk about in the book is that